Mr. Kane, aye.
there any other senators that wish to vote or change their vote? If not, the ayes are 50.
They both are recorded.
If not, the ayes are 51 and the nays are 34. The motion is agreed to. Clerk will now report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of State, Heather Ann Higginbottom of the District of Columbia to be Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources.
To the provisions of S.Res. 15 of the 113th Congress, there will now be up to 8 hours of post-cloture consideration of the nomination, equally divided in the usual form. Who yields time?
If neither side yields time, the time will be equally divided.
If neither side wishes to yield time, the time now will be equally divided. Senator from Kansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Mr. President.
Good morning.
Mr. President, I would like to take a short time here to discuss a situation that I think is gaining some attention in the national news media on a continuing basis, but with the Affordable Health Care Act and what we're doing or not doing here on the floor of the Senate with regards to the 5150 controversy. Perhaps we overlook the number one obligation that we have as members of this body, and that is our national security, the defense of our individual freedoms, and the part that we play in determining the same kind of objectives, liberty and freedom all throughout the world. I'm talking about foreign policy, and I'm talking about the very dangerous situation that we face with regards to Iran. On November 24, the United States and Germany, France, China, Great Britain, and Russia signed an interim deal with Iran agreement regarding its nuclear weapons program. The President and Secretary John Kerry, a former colleague, have applauded this arrangement or this deal. The President has claimed we have opened up a new path forward toward a world that is more secure. And the Secretary of State, who came before us this week and gave senators a briefing, argues this is why we had sanctions in the first place. Mr. President, with all due respect, I disagree. The world, it seems to me, is not a safer place, and in 6 months I do not believe we will be one step closer to dismantling Iran's ability to produce a nuclear weapon. This administration is asking us to trust a regime that has been clear on its intentions, quite frankly, to wipe Israel off the face of the planet, their words. And quite frankly, would be happy to take the United States with it, if you believe their rhetoric. I don't think that represents a step towards security. I think that is misguided at best. This, to me, is not a good plan. I would even reverse that and say it is a bad plan. At this moment, the administration is asking, more than asking, Congress to back down from additional sanctions, which many of us have supported and think would be certainly a better thing to do at this particular time. But at any rate, this is not a request that I can oblige. Sanctions are indeed the reason that Iran has decided to come to the table. But coming to the table and honestly negotiating are certainly two different things. If the reports are true, the administration has been holding secret talks with Iran for months. If you're going to have a deal, an agreement with another country that represents a threat to the United States, obviously that's what you try to do, at least to set up something that would be a workable plan. I don't know what was discussed during those talks. I'm not sure that anyone in the Senate does really know. What did the State Department, the Treasury Department, and the President offer to bring Iran to the public stage? It seems to me that that should be transparent. So I think the Congress and the American people are left to wonder, with regards to transparency, what was arranged before this deal or this peace plan. The bigger problem is that it has taken painstakingly effort on the part of those like myself and others in this body who care about our nation's security and the security of our allies to implement sanctions to the strength that we have today. It has taken a decade. It has taken 6 actions by the Security Council of the United Nations, 10 years of work, and a tremendous effort to finally get people on board. But now the President is asking us to back off after we have gained the support of the international community and just begun to make inroads. The administration is offering to now cut back on these sanctions and to allow the Iranian government to continue enriching uranium. Why? It is widely accepted that the Iranians have no real use for enriched uranium to use for nuclear power because Russia provides fuel supplies for its sole operational nuclear power plant. But they do have use for enriched uranium to contribute to the assembly of a nuclear weapon. Mr. President, why should we back off and only get half of what we want? Why should we not keep applying pressure on Iran through sanctions until they are ready, willing, and able to give up their entire program? Seems to me that it would be in our best interest that Iran would commit to several things for this deal to be a true step towards security. I'm just going to mention a few. Number one, let's just get to the heart of the matter. Public acceptance for the Jewish state of Israel and to allow for the peaceful coexistence of the Israeli people in the Middle East. Nobody in Iran has agreed to that. That is the main issue, the right of Israel to exist. That should be the foundation that we have to start all talks. Then we should have reporting and inspection access to the Parshin facility. P-A-R-C-H-I-N is the name of the facility, and full details of the undeclared nuclear activities. Third, dismantling of Iran's plutonium-producing heavy water reactor at Iraq. Fourth, the construction of new centrifuges. That's got to stop. And lastly, an end to all enrichment. Unfortunately, this agreement fails to include any of these points. If the purpose of sanctions was to get Iran to the negotiating table, how did we walk away without getting what we need, a complete end to Iran's nuclear program? Difficult, but certainly, I think, the overreaching and primary goal. For a decade, Iran has openly disregarded the tenets of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement, legally binding resolutions passed by the United Nations Security Council, and mandatory inspections by the International Atomic Energy Association, the IAEA. All of this completely disregarded by Iran's regime. But the President believes we should trust them now. Why? Because Hassan Rouhani has been elected president, who on the international scene is certainly a smiling president. It is well accepted that however, that the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, does actually control everything in Iran, including its nuclear policy, meaning that Mr. Rouhani's election equates little change for Iran in regards to the public face. Seems to me this is why we cannot back off now. Many of my colleagues, Senator Kirk, Senator Graham, Senator Menendez, just to name a few, are working on a new phase of sanctions. They're tough sanctions, and I'm right there with them. I just don't have any faith with regards to what the Iranians are stating as to where they will be. Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has called this a dangerous blunder. He has warned Israel has the right and the obligation to defend itself by itself against any threat. It concerns me that the administration has no Phase 2 plan in place for the end of this 6 months period. And if in fact we ease the sanctions, which we are doing, and people take advantage of easing those sanctions and are doing business with Iran, to put those same sanctions back in place, or tougher sanctions back in place, is going to be very difficult. One of my colleagues described this as once the toothpaste is out of the tube, you can't put it back. 10 years, 6 different attempts in the Security Council finally taking a stand. How do you put back the sanctions we have had in place that brought Iran to the table if, in fact, at the end of this period, no progress is being made? Not to mention the tougher sanctions that those of us have proposed. So it's a real concern. The administration's hope, of course, is that this leads to a stronger long-term agreement. I hope this works out, but I am highly skeptical. When the interim agreement is up, I think Iran will remain capable of producing a nuclear weapon in a mere few weeks, because we are failing to ask more of that regime. At that moment, we must have a very strong sanctions in place to ensure Iran does not weaponize with regards to its nuclear capability. I fully support a new round of sanctions, and I will continue to work with my colleagues to ensure that these are passed before the 6 months period is over. Unfortunately, if we do not take this kind of action, Iran is set to gain everything while the United States loses, not just the United States, but Israel and Europe as well. Ending Iran's nuclear weapons program entirely is what I consider a path toward a world that would be more secure. In today's issue of the Wall Street Journal, there's an editorial called Mood Music Diplomacy on Iran. Basically, it just simply states more sanctions would strengthen the United States' leverage with Tehran. And it closes by saying that Secretary Kerry now likes to quote Ronald Reagan's trust but verify mantra for dealing with Iran. And it goes on to say, but the Gippers' real legacy was to show resolve when it counted. The Obama administration and their opposition to new sanctions with a delayed trigger feeds suspicions, according to this editorial, that it is eager to accept just about any agreement with Iran, and it states that members of Congress from both parties who want a good and credible deal can help by passing a new sanctions bill. I think that is advice well taken. I yield the floor.
If there's nobody that seeks recognition, the time will be equally divided.
Mr. President,
Senator from Kansas.
after careful inspection, it seems to me that I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from Arkansas.
I would ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I have one unanimous consent request for a committee to meet during today's session of the Senate. It has the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that this request be agreed to and that this request be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I yield back the remaining time on the Democratic side on this nomination.
All Democratic time is yielded back.
And I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Waiting for senators to come to the floor early this Friday morning, December the 13th. The Senate has been in session continuously since 2 p.m. on Wednesday afternoon. Senators have been debating and voting on a series of judicial and executive nominations. Changes to Senate rules last month allowed for each nomination to pass with a simple majority. In the process, Republicans have been using all of their allotted debate time before voting to confirm each nominee. At hand at the moment is the nomination of Heather Ann Higginbottom of the District of Columbia to be the Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources. 8 hours of debate were allotted for this nomination. Democrats have yielded back their time, leaving 4 hours for Republicans bringing a vote on Ms. Higginbottom's nomination in the noon hour today. A short while ago, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid spoke about the Senate schedule. The way the schedule is currently set up, there is still a number of hours of debate ahead, bringing the nominee to lead the Department of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, President Obama's nominee, potentially up for a vote tomorrow night. That would be Saturday night. Senate Majority Leader Reid was also speaking about the need to bring to the Senate as quickly as possible bills that have been passed in the House, the bipartisan budget agreement, as well as the defense authorization bill. That budget agreement was passed by members of the House yesterday. I would say 2-year, $85 billion budget agreement. The vote was 332 to 94. 169 Republicans and 163 Democrats voted for the bill, while 62 Republicans and 32 Democrats voted against the bill. Back to the Senate, senators have been using their time to speak on a number of issues. Republican senators particularly using their time to speak against the Affordable Health Care Law. Other issues being discussed include the situation in the Senate that has led to the current state of affairs. The way Politico put it, at issue is the considerable anger that remains among Republicans over Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid's decision to change Senate rules and eliminate the filibuster on most of Obama's picks for courts and the executive branch. That from Politico. And while we wait for senators to come to the floor, we'll show you some of Senator Orrin Hatch speaking on same.
Mr. President, I've certainly enjoyed the remarks of the distinguished senator from North Dakota. He's done a terrific job here in the Senate. He's made a real difference. And I personally appreciate him very much. We all know we're here for one basic reason. I believe our friends on the other side believe that by creating this kind of a fuss and problem that they can get off of the issue of Obamacare, which is a disaster, and everybody knows it, including them. The fact of the matter is that they've gone from one extreme debacle to another in their, I think, desecration of this body by getting rid of a rule that is absolutely critical to this body. A rule of protection to the minority. I can hardly wait for those on this side of the aisle, the other side of the aisle, who've never been in the minority, for them to get in the minority and realize what they've done is basically destroy the thing that has made the Senate the greatest deliberative body in the world. And there was a filibuster rule, 22, that you could end filibusters. In the early days, back in the early part of the last century, they couldn't get anything done. So they came up with Rule 22 so that they could invoke cloture and end the debate and get back to whatever the Senate decided was the appropriate business. It has worked amazingly well, and it would continue to work amazingly well, except for the fact that our colleagues on the other side have made the Senate no better than the House of Representatives. And the Senate was always supposed to be different from the House of Representatives. It was supposed to be the body that would be more deliberative. I think it was Jefferson who said it's the saucer that cools the tea. Some think it was President Washington who said that. Whoever said it, they were right. The Senate is the body that should cool the tea. The saucer that should cool the tea. That should cool the debates around here. But now it's just whatever the majority wants, and they vote in unison. And they vote in unison because they're supported in unison by a number of very, very well-heeled groups that basically, including the unions especially, that basically Democrats are afraid of crossing. It's a pitiful shame. Well, this filibuster, I'd like to chat just a little bit about this, because it's a time-honored instrument that both sides have used, but there have been, I think, gross misrepresentations of what the filibuster is by the leadership of the other side. And this gross set of misrepresentations should never have been spoken here on the floor. I don't know how they keep a straight face when they do it. Mr. President, on November 21st, 2013, the majority used a premeditated parliamentary gimmick to charge more than 2 centuries of Senate confirmation practice to change it. As a result, for the first time since 1806, the minority cannot extend debate on any nominations except for those that go to the Supreme Court. Democrats accomplished this on a purely party-line vote and by a maneuver designed to avoid scrutiny. It would be hard to imagine a crisis so grave, a conflict so intractable, that the only option was to fundamentally alter the very nature of this institution and further politicize the very confirmation process. Well, I'm here to say that the crisis that the majority said could only be solved that way never existed. The majority leader claimed on November 21st that this crisis was, as he put it, caused by, quote, unprecedented obstruction, unquote, of nominations to both the judicial and the executive branches. More specifically, he said that there had been 163 filibusters of judicial and executive branch nominations, half of them during the Obama administration. By the way, that's totally false, and they know it. I don't know how they can stand on the floor and make these bald-faced assertions. The only solution to the problem, the leader said, was simply to ban nomination filibusters. I noticed that the majority leader made no attempt to either define the filibusters he was counting on, or he was counting, or to identify the nominations on his filibuster list. That was an odd omission because doing so would surely have proved his point, wouldn't it? No. There was a very good reason that the majority leader simply threw out a big number and did identify the filibusters that he claimed justified rigging the confirmation process. If he had simply listed those filibusters, we all would have seen dozens and dozens and dozens of nominations that the Senate had confirmed, many without opposition at all. Since I first took my oath of office on January 3rd, 1977, the United States Senate has confirmed more than 1,700 nominations to the U.S. District Courts, the U.S. Courts of Appeal, and the U.S. Supreme Court, and they've defeated two in all of that time, the last 37 years. We confirmed 78% by unanimous consent, without any roll call vote at all, and two-thirds of the roll call votes we did take were unanimous. Think about that. Where's the problem? No president gets every single appointment he wants, he or she wants, but every president gets the vast majority. During his first term, for example, President Obama was 30% behind his predecessor in nominations. They were sloppy in putting forth nominations, but he ended up only 10% behind in confirmations. That could only mean that the Senate handled his judicial nominations efficiently. During his second term, so far, the Senate has confirmed more than twice as many judicial nominees as it had by this point in President Bush's second term. The Congressional Research Service says that the Senate is confirming President Obama's appeals court nominees faster than the Senate confirmed President Bush's. In fact, President Obama has already appointed 1/4 of the entire federal judiciary. I can also comment on how executive branch nominations referred to the Finance Committee have been handled. Nearly 80% of the nominations sent to the committee during the 112th Congress have so far been confirmed. Looking at executive branch filibusters overall, the same Democratic leaders who last month voted to abolish nomination filibusters voted to filibuster President Bush's nominees to be Assistant Secretary of Defense and EPA administrators, and twice voted to filibuster his nominee to the United Nations ambassador, to be a United Nations ambassador. They must have thought very differently back then about whether the president deserves his team. We've heard a lot about that from the current Democrats. Their actions then spoke more loudly than their words do today about whether they think all nominees really do deserve an up or down vote. Look at the past. Look at what they've done. It's hypocritical. However, the majority will not acknowledge those facts, and others like them because those facts do not fit the spin that they're putting on this. It's hard, after all, to claim an obstruction crisis when so many nominees are confirmed and are being confirmed. So the majority instead makes a claim about what they call filibusters because that sounds bad to most people, and most people will not know whether the claim is even true. Calling something a filibuster does not make it so. A filibuster occurs when the Senate cannot vote on passage of legislation or confirmation of a nomination because an attempt and debate on it fails. That is why filibuster reform always focuses on making it easier to end debate. The filibuster Rule 22 came about after the turn of the last century because they couldn't get anything done in the Senate and they needed a way of bringing things to closure so they could vote. We're headed into the same kind of a disaster without this really important rule. It takes two steps to detect a filibuster: a cloture motion and a cloture vote. You can't have a filibuster without both. And as you can see, a vast majority of what our leader here has claimed are filibusters are not, because they've had a cloture vote. A cloture, or they haven't had a cloture vote, excuse me. A cloture motion is a request to end debate, and a cloture vote answers that request. A filibuster occurs when a cloture vote fails and debate cannot be ended. That's what a definition of a filibuster is. Some people listening to this might already be wondering whether these details really matter, whether the difference between a cloture motion and a cloture vote or the definition of a filibuster are really all that important after all. I'm here today to say that these details do matter, Mr. President, because the truth matters. The truth matters when senators claim that there is a crisis that needs a solution when there really isn't. The truth matters when the majority prohibits the very tool that they used so successfully in the past against Republican nominees. The truth matters when the entire confirmation process is going to be rigged and the judiciary further politicized, like the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. I have been on the Judiciary Committee 37 years. I chaired that committee. I was ranking on that committee. And I can tell you, never in the history of that committee has it been so brazenly ignored. The truth matters because the American people need to know what their senators are really doing. The truth was in short supply on November 21st. The majority leader claimed 168 filibusters, but he was not counting filibusters at all. The majority leader was counting cloture motions, not filibusters. And he had the habit of calling up a bill and almost immediately filing cloture, as though there was a filibuster when nobody intended the filibuster. And then, in prior years, he would fill up the parliamentary tree, so in the greatest deliberative body in the world, you could not have amendments. The minority could not have amendments. There's a time to fill up the tree, but it's only after there's been a full and fair debate and amendments have had their opportunity to be brought forward. They do it to cut off amendments, unless the majority leader approved of whatever the amendments were. Now, I think it's nice to protect your fellow senators on the majority side with legitimate ways of doing it, but this isn't one of them. That alone was causing a lot of discontent on our side, because the majority leader was counting cloture motions, not filibusters, and claiming there were filibusters when there weren't. He was counting requests to end debate, not the answers to those requests. Most people probably do not know that the majority leader files nearly all cloture motions, as he did just a few days ago, by adding 10 more to the list. So if the majority leader claims that there are too many cloture motions filed on nominations, he has only himself to blame. Under President Obama, half of the cloture motions filed on nominations do not result in a cloture vote at all. The rest just vanish into thin air, obviously because they never should have been filed in the first place. Yet that's a scheme that is used by the other side, and then they claim this side as being obstructionist. Two-thirds of the cloture votes that do occur on nominations pass. There's been no discussion of that by the other side. Two-thirds of them pass, preventing filibusters altogether. Here's the filibuster fraud, Mr. President. The majority leader has been using the cloture rule more effectively than in the past, or should I say more obnoxiously than in the past, to prevent filibusters of President Obama's nominations while telling us about unprecedented obstruction. The truth is exactly the opposite of what he has claimed and other Democrats on the other side of the aisle have claimed. Perhaps the most astounding fact of all is that nearly 90% of Obama nominees to the executive or the judicial branch on whom cloture motions were filed have been confirmed. The majority told us that this was about obstruction. about how the minority was using the filibuster to prevent President Obama from appointing people. It's no wonder that the majority leader did not show us the list of the nominations he claims have been filibustered. The claims are a fraud. The majority created this crisis and damaged this institution by claiming that ending debate is really a filibuster and that confirming nominations is really obstructing them. Up is down, left is right, and confirmations are filibusters. All of this is more than a little ironic, since the Democrats were the ones who pioneered using the filibuster to defeat majority-supported judicial nominations. The first judicial nominee with clear majority support to be defeated by a filibuster was Miguel Estrada in 2003, one of the finest lawyers in the country. They didn't want him on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals because they knew on that court, getting on that court is a fast track to the United States Supreme Court. In fact, Democrats were so intent on keeping him off the D.C. Circuit that they filibustered Miguel Estrada, this Latino man, 7 times, a record that stands to this day. I know, I was there. I was fighting for Miguel Estrada, as were all Republicans. As of November 21st, when the majority said that there was an unprecedented filibuster crisis, there had been 12 cloture votes, 12, on Obama judicial nominations, and 6 of them had failed. In other words, there was no obstruction. At that same point in the Bush administration, there had been 26 cloture votes on judicial nominations, and 20 of them had failed. Democrats used the filibuster to defeat Republican nominees to the 5th Circuit, the 6th Circuit, and the 9th Circuit. 3/4 of all votes for judicial nomination filibusters in American history have been cast by Democrats. 3/4. And they have the gall to stand on this floor and suggest that Republicans are using the filibuster to stop nominees. The majority leader alone, at least before complaining of too many filibusters, voted no less than 26 times to filibuster Republican judicial nominees. 26 times. Like I said, the same Democratic leaders abolishing nomination filibusters today voted to filibuster President Bush's nominees to be Assistant Secretary of Defense and EPA Administrator, and twice voted to filibuster his nominee as the United Nations Ambassador. I don't understand, or should I say I don't know, what the majority understands the word, quote, unprecedented, unquote, to mean, but this certainly isn't it. This, Mr. President, is why the truth matters. As of November 21st, when the majority leader claimed that there had been 168 nominations filibusters, only 56 cloture votes on executive or judicial nominations had ever failed, and only 17 of those filibustered nominees had not been confirmed. The crisis that the majority claimed turns out to be a myth, a tale for the fiction section of the newspaper. This is why the truth matters. And let's not forget what the majority did on November 21st. Rule 22, the one that provides a way to end debate, is a written rule, a time-honored rule. It says what it says. And it says that ending debate on any matter before the Senate, with the exception of rules changes, requires 3/5 of all senators. It said that on November 21st, and it says that today. The technical term for what the majority leader did that day was to raise a point of order. But in practical terms, the majority leader asked the presiding officer to say that 3/5 actually means a majority vote. He might just as well have asked the presiding officer to say that Christmas is on December 29th or that the nation's capital is in Salt Lake City, Utah. The presiding officer stated the obvious, that 3/5 means 3/5 because that is what the rule says. That's what the presiding officer, advised by the parliamentarian of the Senate, said. 3/5 means what it says. 3/5, because that is what the rule says. By a purely party line vote, the majority said otherwise. That 3/5 is actually a majority by overruling their own colleague in the chair. This sounds absurd because it is. Now we are forced to act like we can't read, to suspend the most basic ability to understand the English language, and set aside our common sense. We are forced to pretend that the rules of this body say what they don't mean and mean what they don't say. This frankly reminds me of the Wizard of Oz when Dorothy and her friends were before the image they thought was the great and powerful Oz. Their dog Toto pulls on the curtain to reveal a little man frantically operating dials and buttons and speaking into a microphone. The image commands, "Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain." Well, on November 21st, the majority told each of us to pay no attention to the 3/5 in the cloture rule. Now, that was quite a trick. The real question is why the majority would concoct such a fraud in order to rig the confirmation process. What could be so important that the majority would go through such contortions, peddle such myths, and play such word games? It certainly wasn't to solve a filibuster crisis, that's for sure. No, it was for a much more base political reason. The President and the majority here in the Senate deliberately set up this political confrontation in order to implement a political agenda that could not get through Congress. That agenda requires actions and decisions by the two groups of federal officials who are not directly accountable to the American people: bureaucrats in the executive branch and judges in the judicial branch. The President appoints these two categories of officials, but only with the Senate's consent. For more than 200 years, the process of deciding whether to give that consent included the right of the minority to slow things down and, yes, even block the most controversial nominees. I've given you the numbers. Only 17 executive or judicial nominees who were filibustered were not eventually confirmed. But the majority wants it all. They want a clear path to stacking the executive branch with officials who will issue the rules and stacking the judicial branch with judges who will approve those rules. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals is a perfect illustration where much of the regulations are decided by the courts. And they want them decided in favor of President Obama. They want the courts to legislate from the bench that which they could never get through the United States Senate or the House of Representatives. This is a power grab, nothing more and nothing less. And it appears that the ends justify the means, that short-term political gains justify long-term institutional damage. I urge my colleagues from the freshmen to the senior members to take some guidance from our own predecessors. Senator Mike Mansfield, a leading Democrat, the majority leader of the Senate, he had served in the minority and later became majority leader. In 1975, when senators also proposed forcing a rules change by a simple majority, he said that this tactic would, let me quote him, destroy the very uniqueness of this body and diminish the Senate as an institution of this government, unquote. It would, he said, quote, alter the concept of the Senate so drastically that I cannot under any circumstances find any justification for it, unquote. That was the Democrat leader in the United States Senate, a man of unquestionable integrity. As I've explained here today, the majority has certainly not provided any justification for doing away with the filibuster rule either. There is no filibuster crisis. I think I've made that case. There is only a desire by the majority to win every time, to have everything they want, when and how they want it. Most of the executive and judicial branch nominations that the majority claims were filibustered were actually confirmed. Even in this town known famously for masterful spin, that will surely go down as legendary. The majority abolished nomination filibusters by claiming nominations that were confirmed were actually obstructed when they were confirmed. This amounts to filibuster fraud. That is why we're here today, Mr. President, because the truth matters. The integrity of the United States Senate matters. And I can only hope that there is time for those two concepts to still prevail. Mr. President, what the Democrats have done here is not only extremely dangerous, it's outrageous. They've taken one of the things that really makes the United States Senate the great body that it is and have desecrated it. And they've done it because a number of the Democrats over here have never been in the minority. They don't realize how awful that rule is. They don't realize that the filibuster is a rule of freedom that protects the minority and makes the Senate debate on these matters. I once said I'd fight to my death for the filibuster rule because it's what makes the United States Senate different from the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is the people's body. They can do anything once they get a rule and get 51% of the votes. Anything. And it was structured that way. The Senate was structured another way. And our young new senators on the other side don't seem to understand that. I've chatted with a number of more senior senators who've been through being in the minority, who've been through some of the battles here. And let me tell you, they're as concerned as I am that this body is totally damaged by this breaking of the rules, destroying the rules for purely partisan purposes. They can talk about how they just want the Senate to work all they want to. The Senate's never going to work as well without this rule. And a minority will never be protected as well without this rule. And I've got to tell you, I hope we can get this rule put back in place. Even though it's a disadvantage to Republicans right now, because they now have 3 more liberal senators on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals that was divided 4-4, Republican nominees to Democrat nominees.
The senator's time has expired.
I ask for another 90 seconds.
Is there objection?
4-4. I'll try and even be shorter than that. Now they stack it in the most important court in the country as far as regulatory affairs are concerned and administrative law is concerned, so that they can pass through that court the Obama administration's legislative claims and desires. Without having to face real debate. There was a reason why the Founding Fathers had 3 separated powers. Because each of those powers is to protect our country. They're making it so on regulatory matters, administrative court matters, and so forth, there's really only 1/6 power for Republicans. Mr. President, there was an incorrect reference to the House bill number in a consent agreement earlier today with respect to the Fallen Firefighters Assistance Tax Clarification Act. I ask unanimous consent that the previous order be modified to reflect the correct House bill number, H.R. 3458.
Objection. Seen, hearing none? No, without objection.
Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Waiting for senators to come to the floor in this Senate session that began on Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time in the afternoon. The Senate has been in session continuously since then, debating and voting on a series of judicial and executive nominations. The pending nomination is that of Heather Ann Higginbottom of the District of Columbia to be the Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources. Senators have been debating a variety of issues using the time allotted. In that time allotted, the Senate schedule brings us potentially into Saturday night with 30 hours of debate scheduled for President Obama's nominee to lead the Homeland Security Department, Jeh Johnson. Earlier this morning, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid mentioned that he hopes to bring other Senate business to the floor, including the two-year $85 billion budget agreement that was passed yesterday in the House by a vote of 332 to 94. 169 Republicans and 163 Democrats voted for the bipartisan budget agreement. 62 Republicans, 32 Democrats voted against the bill. Majority Leader Reid also saying that he wanted the Senate to take up the defense bill, another bill that is yet to come before the Senate. Senators during these debates on nominations have used their time to talk about a number of issues. Republicans mainly speaking against the Affordable Health Care Act. Yesterday, Senators James Inhofe and John McCain came to the floor to talk about the defense bill that is yet to be voted on in the Senate, and we'll show you some of this while we wait for senators to come to the floor.
Well, we went through something, and I want to talk a little bit about the National Defense Authorization Act. Every year we have a National Defense Authorization Act. That act is more important than anything else we do around here, in my opinion. Now, if you read the Constitution, it'll say providing for the nation's defense is our major concern. This is what we're supposed to be doing. And so we have always had, in fact, for 51 consecutive years, we've passed an NDAA bill prior to January. And it's always been that way. This is a budget that must take place. Now, this is very disturbing to me because the House passed an NDAA bill some time ago. We in the Senate, in the Senate Armed Services Committee, way back, was it May or June? I guess it was in June. In June, we passed the NDAA out of our committee, not unanimously, but by almost unanimously, and it was bipartisan, strong bipartisan support to come to the floor. Well, it never came up. And why it never came up is not that important right now. The fact is, we're now in a position where we have to do it and have to have one coming up it has to be this coming week. So anyway, we put together a bill. There's a thing a lot of people don't understand because it's not very often used. But when the House and the Senate are not able to put something together, they go to the big four. They get the Committee of Jurisdiction. In this case, the Senate Armed Services Committee. So they had the chairman, the ranking member. The ranking member is the one that has the most rank from the minority. That's me in the case of the Senate. And then the chairman of the House and the ranking member of the House. 4 people. We sat together 10 days ago here in Washington and put together a bill, taking the best parts out of the House bill, best parts out of the Senate bill, and put together this thing. And it's one that I think when people understand it, it is one that I don't know of anyone who would really oppose it. The problem we're having is that the way it was done is not the way it should have been done. It should have been done as it's been done in the past, and that is take about, well, it's been in the last 10 years, it's taken 9 days average to pass this bill. So we have all of the amendments processed, and people come forth with amendments. Well, that didn't happen this time. So what we did in this bill, we took 79 of the amendments that people had in the House and in the Senate, Republicans and Democrats, and we did 79. That's 41 Republican amendments and 38 Democrat amendments. These are ones that had been introduced on the Senate floor, and we were able to go ahead and put these into the bill. So we have a good bill. It's out there. We need to we really need to do it. And I believe that if people are concerned about the process, I am concerned. We're going to get busy to make sure this doesn't happen in future years. We don't want it to happen, but we don't want our service people who are in harm's way today to be paying for the fact that we had a procedure that was wrong. We have a vehicle here. We have a bill. It will come up for consideration. It will come over from the House, and I anticipate first part of the week we'll have this bill. Now, what does it do? First, it authorizes 37 special incentive pays, including reenlistment bonuses and certain health professionals bonuses. Here we're talking about people who are considering reenlisting right now. They're in the service. I mentioned a minute ago some of the aviators. Well, this is just mostly the Army and the Marines and the Navy. These people are making career decisions. They make career decisions predicated on what they anticipate is going to be out there. And what's going to be out there is what kind of a bonus they'll get at the time. And, of course, if in the event this doesn't happen, they would not be entitled to these bonuses if we don't pass this bill. That's how significant it is. When you talk about certain health professional bonuses, they would expire also. And these health benefit bonuses are very significant because these